The dream of every pawn is to become a queen. Look at this guy right here. He'd love to become a queen. But to do that, he's got to get past the enemy pawns first. In fact, there's 3 of them. 3 pawns he's got to get through. First is the pawn right in front of him. But he's also got to get past the pawns on the right and the left. And only when he can get past all 3 of those pawns will he become what's called a pass pawn. And then he'll be able to get a queen. Consider this pawn right here. He's on a long journey. All the way down to the other end of the board, he wants to become a queen. But in order to do that, he's first got to get past these 2 guys right here. Him and him. I said, no, you're not getting past us. Well, he wants to become a queen. He can pass this pawn here. Maybe he just keeps going here. Of course, he could take this guy. There's different ways to become a pass pawn, and now he's a pass pawn. That means there's no more pawns in front of him. And that means he's on his way to becoming the queen. Powerful pawn. Let's look at this position. There's 3 pass pawns on this board. Can you find them? I'll give you a hint. Black has 2 and white has 1. Remember, a pass pawn is a pawn that has no enemy pawns in front or to the right or to the left that could stop it from getting to the queening square. This pawn right here on B7 is a pass pawn. Yeah, I know, it hasn't even moved, so how could it be past anything? Well, we still call it a pass pawn because there are no white pawns all the way down to the queening square. No white pawns could possibly take it. This pawn here is a pass pawn on C5. Why is it a pass pawn? Because there's no possible way a pawn, any white pawn, can capture this pawn. And he's got a free path to the queening square. And what's the last pass pawn? This one right here by white on D5. It's a pass pawn because there are no black pawns that could possibly capture it. He's also got a free and clear path to the queening square. Pass pawns are a very powerful thing. Now, there's 3 ways we can get a pass pawn. Let's have a look at these. The first way is pretty basic, pretty simple. You can just move your pawn up, and instead of capturing the other pawn, you just push. Hey, I just passed you. There we go, I've got a pass pawn. Well, that's one way. What's another way? Well, we can eliminate a pawn by capturing it with another piece, or maybe the pawn itself. So here our knight takes this pawn, munch munch, and now we got a pass pawn. And there's one more way. Let's say we push here and black goes here. We can get a pass pawn when black simply moves his pawns out of the way. So sometimes your opponent will just move their pawns out of the way like that, giving you a pass pawn, which is a very good thing for us. Now let's think of pawns as 3 levels. You know, play games, levels, character levels. There's level 1 pawns, level 2 pawns, and level 3 pawns. Let's just think of pawns this way, just for a minute. So a level 1 pawn, let's just call them all the pawns we start with. Look at all these guys. They're just your basic level 1 pawns. And this guy here is a level 2 pawn. And what is a level 2 pawn? A level 2 pawn is a passed pawn. Level 2 pawns are passed because they're on their way to becoming a queen. This guy right here on E6, he is a passed pawn. He's got no white pawns that could capture him. And this guy here on B4 is also a passed pawn because there's no black pawns that can capture this guy. So let's just call these guys, voila, level 2 pawns. Yeah, these pawns are pretty dangerous. So if you're the white king, you kind of want to protect your level 2 pawn. You want to protect that passed pawn a little bit more than those other guys on the other side of the board, and that's the same with black. Black has a free path to the queening square, and white has a free path to the queening square. These are very valuable pawns. Passed pawns, remember, are more valuable than other pawns. They just are. And so it's not easy to get a passed pawn, but when you do, that means that pawn is closer to becoming a queen. So we can call them our level 2 pawns. Now you may be thinking, all right, we got these level 2 pawns. Well, what's a level 3 pawn? Let's have a look. Oh, it's been a long road for me. I'm just an old pawn. Come on, you naughty pawns. I'm gonna show you what I got. Watch this. Going to level 3. Boom. Queen. That's right. Level 3 pawn. Think of that as time for a promotion. Time to get a queen. Ah, it's a beauty. And just think. That queen once was a measly little level 1 pawn. All right. So now we know what passed pawns are. It's time to talk about a little, somewhat uncommon rule in chess called en passant. En passant is French. It simply means in passing. But it's a very important rule. So let's look at this board here. White may think to himself, it's white to move. Hey, I can get a passed pawn. This is going to be a piece of cake. I'm just going to go here to d4. Look at that, guys. Now I got a passed pawn, haha. But what does black here say? Black says, that doesn't feel fair. You didn't even give me a chance to capture you. Aren't I allowed to capture this white pawn? Actually, yes. This black pawn on c4 can capture that pawn on d4 en passant. And he captures it as if it moved 1 space. Now we saw that white pawn move forward too. Well, black can then capture it because he tried to pass him up by going forward 2. Black can simply take it. And in this case, black munches this pawn. Ah! And now it's black who's got the passed pawn. Oops. Big mistake by white pushing that pawn too. Think of en passant as you pass not.
You shall not pass!
En passant, you pass not. Let's go over en passant. En passant, number 1, only applies when a pawn moves 2 squares. So if a pawn is only moved 1 square, it doesn't apply. So when a pawn moves 2 squares, and that pawn who just moved 2 squares passes your pawn or an opponent's pawn on that 5th rank, so he moved forward 2 and he passes you up while he's doing it, on your next turn you can capture that pawn as if it moved forward 1 square. Now this is a very important rule for en passant. You only have 1 chance to capture that pawn. So when that pawn goes forward 2, on your next turn, you can capture it, but if you don't, you'll never get another chance to en passant that particular pawn. So let's look at this. One more example. Very easy. It's black to move. So let's say that black decides he's going to push this pawn forward 2. Now white can capture en passant. See? He tried to pass him up. So white can capture. He moved forward 2. Now let's go back. Now what about this pawn on c6? Black pushes him 1. In this case, white cannot capture en passant because he only went forward 1. White had a chance to capture him last turn and he didn't. So white cannot capture en passant. En passant only applies when you move forward 2 squares. And see, look at that. Now you know what en passant is.